Hi everyone, welcome to the fourth video now in this series. This is going to be our last video for 1 Timothy 2. And really what I want to do in this video is to discuss why Paul anchors his instruction from verse 11 and verse 12 in chapter 2 into the Genesis story. And we're going to talk a little bit around what the significance of that is for us. So Paul has this instruction that he gives for women to learn or women not to teach or to have authority, with the whole guiding aim of that being that the woman should be in quietness, a quietness of heart, a peaceability. And then he gives this explanation for that. And he says, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. And it wasn't the man who was deceived, it was Eve who was deceived. What's he getting at here? Well, complementarians tend to point to this verse and say this is proof that Paul's instruction, particularly in verse 12, must have been universal, because he anchors it not in the context of the day, but in Genesis. And that is a good point, but there are a couple of reasons why that might not be as conclusive as it first sounds. Firstly, I do want to make it really clear that the Greek doesn't separate out verse 11 and verse 12 as two separate things, but rather with the framing device and with the conjunction between them, it's clear that it's one big thought that Paul is presenting, that women should learn, but that they shouldn't be teaching or having authority. And so it's that entire frame, that entire thought that's being rooted in the Genesis account. What is it about the Genesis account that he wants us to see? Well, it's creation order that he's pointing to. Adam came first, then Eve. And to express that more fully, or as the punchline, he then says Eve was the one deceived. Well, it makes it a little bit difficult to root teaching or having authority and the prohibition against those two things in the Genesis account for a number of reasons. Firstly, it would be more convincing had Paul stated that it was Eve who was the one who led Adam astray in the Genesis account, which would be accurate from the account. But that's not the part of the story that he's pointing to. It's Eve's deception that he's pointing to. Which makes it less likely that this is his punchline for why women shouldn't teach or have authority. That would make more sense if he was saying Eve led Adam astray, but rather a punchline for why women should be learning well, because you're only at risk of deception if you haven't learned well. It's not when you're speaking that you're likely to be deceived, but rather when you're learning, if you haven't learned what you needed to well, that you're likely to be deceived or vulnerable to deception. And it certainly fits, this idea fits very well with the sense in the letter and in 2 Timothy, where we're shown that actually it was the women who were being deceived largely by the false teaching. And so Paul referencing Eve's deception here really is a strong bottom line for why he is requiring them to learn, but to learn in submission, learn in a way that's peaceable, learn in a way that isn't rebellious against those who are teaching them. Why then is creation order significant? Well, it was the very fact that Adam came first and then Eve that required Eve to learn from Adam. We see in the Genesis account that God gives Adam the instruction not to eat from the tree. And so Eve, when she's created, is dependent on Adam to learn from him the instructions that God has given, much like the women in Ephesus would be dependent on the men who had a culture of education in scriptures that the women didn't. And so when Paul references creation order, he's not referencing an authoritative order, because that actually wouldn't make sense with deception being the punchline. If Eve was created with less authority than Adam, that wouldn't make her a natural target for deception. Being of less authority doesn't make you more likely to be deceived necessarily. But creation order makes much more sense if Paul is trying to let the women know, teach the women here, you need to learn just as Eve needed to learn from Adam. Adam had the educational advantage, if you like. He had had that instruction from God where Eve wasn't present, and so Eve needed to learn. And in fact, when we look at the Genesis account, we see that Eve didn't learn very well, because when she's talking with the serpent, she misquotes God. And so that would make real sense of this reference to Genesis. Paul saying, listen, what's happening here is actually very similar to what happened in the garden. Adam had an educational advantage. He came first. Eve was therefore dependent on Adam. She couldn't rebel. She shouldn't rebel from him. She shouldn't see herself as knowing just as much as him. That would cause her to be in a place of vulnerability. And in fact, because she didn't learn so well, she was vulnerable to deception and was indeed deceived. And so it's not so conclusive to point to the Genesis account and say Paul roots all of his teaching on women not teaching or having authority in Genesis, but rather is more of reference about the whole thought, giving explanation as to why women need to learn well. The second reason why I think this isn't conclusive for a complementarian argument is something that Douglas Moo, in fact, raises. He says that references to Genesis from the New Testament aren't really conclusive proof that those are universal instructions if we can see a clear separation of a principle and an application in the teaching. And he points to the teaching in Corinthians about head coverings. There's a reference to creation order there, but in fact, the application and the principle can be separated out, where we understand that head coverings do not mean in our day what they meant in the ancient day, and so we shouldn't apply that teaching in the same way, but rather should understand the principle and apply the principle in a meaningful way. Douglas Moo says 1 Timothy isn't that scenario because he cannot see a separate principle. I find that strange because, as we've seen, there is a very clear principle of peaceability being threaded through the entire teaching. There's a very clear principle of women needing to have a quietness of attitude, of women needing to be in submission, being threaded through. And really, if that's what Paul is trying to show us in saying Eve came second, she needed to be dependent on Adam. She needed to submit to Adam in that moment to learn from him well. If Paul is rooting that principle in Genesis, then there's absolutely no reason for us to be rooting the application, which was the prohibition of teaching and having authority in that context, into the Genesis account. There's no reason for us to make that application universal. Rather, we must recognize that the principle is universal. So over the last 4 videos, what we've done is we've had a look at the context. We've had a look at the guiding principle. We've had a look at how there is really good reason to see this not as a universal principle, but as a temporary principle that was conditional on the context. We have looked at the specific words that were used and have really seen that if we do want to use this as a universal prohibition, we really can't start drawing lines around what kind of teaching or what context of teaching, but rather we've got to admit that Paul is talking about any scriptural teaching in any church context. And now we've just looked a little bit at the Genesis account and why that isn't in and of itself conclusive proof that this is a universal instruction that we need to apply in the same way today. In all honesty, this section of scripture can be applied universally. You do have enough in the Greek to make us see this as a universal restriction. Like I've said, I don't think it is enough. I don't think it is convincing enough in the face of all the reasons why it isn't universal. But we can, if we want, bring this as a universal restriction. But if we do that, we have a problem with the rest of the New Testament. We have so many verses in the New Testament that we then need to somehow explain, somehow bring further caveats of gender qualification in, which Paul never put into those verses. We have to bring explanation around Ephesians 4, where Paul talks about apostles, prophets, teachers, pastors, evangelists. We have to bring a gender disqualification, somehow put in brackets as if Paul forgot to, that women aren't included in this list. Or we have to bring in gender disqualification in Romans 12. And in fact, the ESV has tried to do that, where it uses male pronouns when it talks about teaching and exhortation. It's done that not because they exist in the Greek, because they don't, but because of their understanding of 1 Timothy 2. And so there becomes a little bit of a tricky way that we have to navigate the New Testament if we want to make this a universal prohibition, because Paul didn't seem to support it as a universal prohibition. He didn't seem to support it as a universal prohibition where he taught on spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians. He didn't seem to support it as a universal prohibition in Romans 16, where he honors men and women who've done incredible public ministry. And so we can make this a universal restriction. We would be justified in some ways in the Greek. It's difficult to put that comfortably next to the rest of the New Testament. Or, equally as justifiably, we can see this as a temporary prohibition. And if we do that, it is then so beautiful to put this scripture, this passage of 1 Timothy alongside the rest of scripture, because it fits so comfortably. It fits so well next to the rest of New Testament teaching. They don't no longer seem at odds with one another, but in fact, if we understand this as a teaching that was appropriate for the context, then this scripture, this text in 1 Timothy 2 sits very comfortably alongside the rest of the New Testament. It's for you and I to decide ultimately in good conscience what we feel most comfortable with. But for me, I must say, with the evidence at hand and with the broader brush strokes of scripture, I struggle to find reason to apply this as a universal prohibition.